So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our book group for Maundy Thursday. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty Father, whose dear Son, on the night before he suffered, instituted the sacrament of his body and blood, mercifully grant that we may receive it thankfully in remembrance of Jesus Christ our Lord, who in these holy mysteries gives us a pledge of eternal life, and who now lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
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 So, Maundy Thursday. Actually, a number of the themes of from earlier in the week continue in chapter 5. Any first thoughts from anybody before we move in?
Why don't we just go through piece by piece,
Certainly.
story by story?
Mm-hmm.
I've been very quiet prior to this because I was behind on the book. I finally have caught up on every chapter. And
Marvelous.
the first thing that struck me about today, I might point out, because I did not know what Maundy, Thursday meant. We call it Holy Thursday in the Catholic Church. And this explained to me for the first time ever what that meant. So interestingly, I'm also a member of a men's prayer group that's meeting on Zoom on Thursday mornings earlier. And these guys are mostly Assemblies of God, and there's a Lutheran, and I'm the only Catholic, but none of them knew what Maundy, Thursday, meant.
Really?
I was surprised because one of them is a pastor in the Assemblies of God Church in Enumclaw. He didn't know what Maundy meant in terms of the day. So that was interesting, very interesting.
But he calls it Maundy Thursday in his tradition?
No, they don't do much for about the Thursday and Friday of the Holy Week. They are all about the Easter. Good Friday, maybe a little. They don't have services like we do in the Episcopal and Catholic Church. Lutherans do, as you might know, but the one Lutheran didn't even know really. He knew it was called Maundy Thursday, but he didn't know what it meant, the mandate.
Well, if I hadn't gone to seminary, I might not know it either. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to have called it Maundy Thursday to you for all these years and never have explained it. So, mea culpa.
Anyway, it's good. It makes sense. It's that commandment so important. And that the other thing that was interesting is that we're studying Mark, and he brings it out, but it was John that had the great commandment and the Maundy. Mark didn't have it.
Well, and what's the other thing, the interesting thing that we're going to run into now for the whole rest of this book is that we're studying Mark's gospel, but in church, John's gospel takes center stage from this day forward. It's always John's gospel. It's the new commandment in John's gospel is the gospel, and the foot washing is the gospel on Maundy Thursday. On Good Friday, it's always John 18:1 through 1937. St. John's Passion is always the Passion narrative on Good Friday. And interestingly, it's at the Great Vigil of Easter. It's always Matthew. It's the gospel that's read at the vigil, and then it all depends. Nikki, I'm gonna mute you for a second while you get everything all situated.
And I was listening to Kathleen's bird. I can hear her bird.
You can hear my bird? I'll close the door. That'll help. Oh, my bird is very unhappy lately and lecturing me a lot.
So on page 110, one of the first things our authors point out is how different Mark's story is from John's. And these are important differences, which, again, who knows? In our search for truth, we are not going to find historicity. Because in all the synoptic gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what happens on Maundy Thursday is on the day of Passover. And it's the Passover meal, the first day of Passover, the Passover meal, which is the Last Supper. In John's Gospel, which takes center stage in terms of our liturgical observance at this time of year, it's the day before the Passover, because the Passover is the day upon which Jesus is crucified. And as they point out, I mean, there are theological things that are happening in that John has Jesus and makes mention of the fact that Jesus dies at the same time that the lambs are sacrificed at the temple for the Passover meal. And in fact, Jesus has to come down off the cross because it would be a sacrilege to have Jesus on the cross on Passover, which is why he's taken down at that time. And we don't see that same, they're different stories, they're conflicting stories. And, you know, again, the question of what's true and the question of what is factual or historically accurate are two different things, one of which we can say that it's all true and that there's truth to be found in all of this. And at the same time, we will never have a historical understanding, an accurate historical understanding. We'll never be able to say, well, this is what happened at this time on this day, because we're never going to know. It's not, human beings didn't record history that way at that time. And it's beyond our knowing. And so it's just important to keep all that stuff in mind as we push farther into Mark's story. I mean, as is pointed out in our story as well, you know, Peter on Maundy Thursday / Good Friday, and the overnight as heading to Good Friday, you know, Jesus tells Peter that the cock will crow, he will deny him 3 times before the cock crows twice. And the rooster is not so verbose in the other gospels. And, you know, again, who knows what actually happened? And I'm not even sure that, I don't think our authors give us a sense of why it might be important that it's twice in Mark and once in the others. But regardless, we're left with this question. I don't know what to make of it. It just is what it is.
The thing I thought was interesting historically, and the author points out that the history around the trial by the chief priests and the scribes, that trial wasn't witnessed by any disciples because they all fled. They all took off. So who knows who presented that history? As the author has pointed out in the book, he did say that it could have been some other person that witnessed it that reported it to Mark later.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to cross-reference and look it up. I'm not sure that it's quite that clear that everybody fled and that nobody went and witnessed the trial in the other gospels. And that could be, again, just in order to who knows why that would be. It could well just be that it's to close up a loophole that's problematic in the gospel text. But I think the other thing, you know, as Mark tells at the bottom of page 111, as Mark tells the story, Jesus knows what will happen. We need not attribute this to supernatural foreknowledge. Jesus must have known that the noose was tightening, that the cross was approaching. He could not have been oblivious to the hostility of the authorities, and he may well have regarded his arrest and execution as inevitable, not because of divine necessity, but because of what he could see happening around him. You know, it doesn't take a genius to observe in Jesus' time that as he is, you know, riding in and making a profound mockery of Roman power on Sunday, and then overturning the temple on Monday, and continuing to have, and you know, sees all the temple authorities each trying to take a pass at him and get him to convict himself on Tuesday. You know, you have to see how this is headed toward an inevitable conclusion in terms of the way that society was structured at that time. I mean, there's no doubt, there can be no doubt in Jesus' mind what's going to happen, which doesn't mean that he can't wish that it wouldn't. And so at Gethsemane, he can express that lament, but it also doesn't mean that I don't think it's reasonable to think that there's any question in his mind, and he knew that he was being provocative from the start. Again,
Like waiting for labor.
kind of, yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, and it's inevitable what's going to happen here. The Last Supper, Web of Meetings, page 112. All 12 disciples, including Judas, come to the upstairs room where the arrangements have been made. And there are three main elements of Mark's story, as the authors point out. They eat the Passover meal together. Jesus speaks of his imminent betrayal, and Jesus invests the bread and wine with meanings associated with his impending death. So, again, Jesus knows that he's going to be betrayed, and in fact, Mark has been foreshadowing this since the beginning. I mean, he has. What was that?
What was that?
That was mine.
Oh, there you go.
Picture changed.
Yeah, I mean, and the betrayal of, as they point out, and I think rightly, is not simply Jesus's. Jesus is going to be betrayed by everybody in one way or another. Judas betrays him the most significantly, to be sure. But Peter denies him, and everybody else scatters to the wind. Everybody sort of bails out because they want to protect their own skins. And thankfully, most of them grow a backbone by the end of the Acts of the Apostles, at least, and we see that they mature into real leaders, but they're not showing it on this night.
On page 113, it says the theme of failed discipleship continues to be central.
Yeah, more than half. Yeah, and continuing on, more than half of the narration of Thursday evening and night is devoted to it. 33 out of 61 verses is about betrayal, and not just by Judas, but by everybody. Jesus invests this meal, bread and wine. Meals have been such a significant part of Jesus' ministry. Most of his teaching happens around meals, and they go on to talk about feeding of the multitudes, I really well, we'll get there in a second.
Well, I think at the bottom of the page, it talks about his meal practice was about inclusion in a society with sharp social boundaries. So it had both religious and political significance.
Certainly, yeah.
That it was done in the name of the kingdom of God, and political because it included everybody.
Yeah, I mean, eating with tax collectors and sinners, which of course means prostitutes for the most part, but you can't use that word because this is the Bible after all, so you have to hide it. But that is what he's mostly accused of. Remember, tax collectors were the actual mechanism by which the temple ruled. I mean, they were the worst betrayers of their people, because they were not only instruments of Rome, but they made their living by extorting people. Rome said, you can collect this much tax, of which the tax collector gets to keep X. Of course, the tax collector could, if they could get more out of you, they could keep it. And so, they were the harbingers of woe for so many in this era, especially again, as Galilee didn't have a functioning economy at this point. It was a barter economy. They didn't use currency, and so, everything you had to create your own, produce your own goods, and your own durable goods, and then had to figure out how to sell them somewhere where people had money in order to offer the money that was required. It was a huge burden.
Wonder if the setup for sending the money to those people that need it the most, perhaps they have not filed their taxes for 18 and 19, and who says they will get it if they owed money, Occurred to me. That may be the case. And when you were talking about feeding, like here in Olympia, they're feeding about 42 people twice a day when they were feeding them once a day. And many comments are being made about the homeless in different areas. And it's taken kind of a sour note. I hope it doesn't continue, but there's two sides to those stories, always, you know, about feeding anyone who isn't worthy, as if we're worthy. I don't know, just occurred to me.
Well, in 115, he says the point of the story is not multiplication, but distribution.
Right.
That we distribute what we have.
Right.
And there's enough for all when it passes through the hands of Jesus, through divine justice.
That's why we distribute money through our outreach committee. We call them distributions. Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Well, the meal practice of Jesus is a real act of social justice, which I never thought of it that way, but it is. It's all included in the table, just like RC says when we have communion. All are welcome. And
I like the way he says it. That I agree in that the authors state that shared meals is the mandate of divine justice in a world not our own.
Mhm.
And the theme that I love in this book, it's so about social justice from, against the Roman imperial army. They're evidence that they are oppressing the people and the temple's oppressing the people. And it's all about Jesus coming to bring justice in the world. And I love that theme.
Talk about social justice. Catholic Community Services has been doing social justice far longer than many of us, including myself, a way long time. The Catholic nuns, now the nuns around the world, and Catholic Community Services is going to be taking on another.
One of the few things that the Catholic Church can still be proud of. There's enough that we taken flack for, but that is true. That is a great.
And here in Olympia, St. Mike's does a very good job of clothing and feeding people in need.
They do.
Yes.
Just to make clear, Jim is talking smack about the church to which he belongs and in which he was raised and which he attends weekly, more than once. So, lest we and I do know that people watch this after the fact, and I've been getting comments from people who are picking up on these conversations that we're having and following along on Facebook after we post them afterwards. And so, just to be very clear to everybody, anybody who may see this,
That's accurate.
It's never a good look for Episcopalians to be taking pot shots at other denominations, but far be it from me to tell a Roman Catholic how to talk about their own church.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's
Great.
value in having ecumenical meetings, as Jim does, Bob does right now with Catholics, and I don't know what Jim Presley is anymore, but very conservative. And Tony Irving, they share the gospel every week as best they can at Wagner's. So 7 a.m. when they can get in, now they can't go. So it's good for all of us to hear in different denominations and to love each other just for who we are and not for what we think we know.
Well, let's return to the text. On page 116, they talk about this being a Passover meal and sort of the importance of that. And this was a point that I hadn't ever considered before I read this. It occurred on the evening before the 10th plague to strike Pharaoh in Egypt, the death of the firstborn, and it was the plague. This was a meal that was shared before the plague that freed the Israelites In that context, sort of, this was the meal which stayed the hand of death for them, which was about to inflict itself on all of Egypt. And second, and this point I found really compelling, that the Passover meal, the first Passover meal, was food for the journey. It was also a last supper for them in the place that they were before they disappear, before they go into the wilderness, before they go into the wilderness. And then remember, end up eating manna for 40 years, manna which is not good. It's not delicious. They did not taste good, and or at least it wasn't. And certainly you'd get bored of it after 40 years.
It says its purpose was protection against death and food for the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at Jesus' own time, this meal would be eaten, sort of ready to go. You'd have your sandals on as a reminder of the fact that this was a last supper, and that you were remembering that, and you'd be ready to leave, and in order to remember the Passover of the Lord. It memorializes the first Passover in the Exodus by bringing it into the present. For the empire of Pharaoh, substitute the Roman Empire or any other empire, and the subversive nature of the story is not difficult to discern. This was truly, I mean, again, there is a political aspect to what Jesus is doing here, and it is intentional that he is sharing this meal with them, and that things come to a head at this time, because the temple authorities don't want this to run into Passover, and so they want things to resolve themselves, and Jesus wants to use this as an opportunity to make a point about their relationship to Rome and to the temple authorities who are complicit with Rome, and use the story of Passover as a way to make that point. And he does it very eloquently. The body and blood and the death of Jesus. These these words of institution, as we know them, these are the words that we hear every time we celebrate the Eucharist. In fact, they're the only words that are sort of mandated. Without the words of institution, it's not a Eucharist, and it doesn't count. Take, this is my body, and then this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. And many in Greek can easily be made into all. It's not clear that I mean, that's a traditional translation, but it's perfectly acceptable. And so when you hear in many of our Eucharistic prayers, poured out for all, that that's not a touchy-feely gloss, but there is scholarship and sound theology behind it. Matthew, it's interesting that as they say on 117 to 118 in Matthew, the words over the bread are almost identical to Mark's. The words over the cup are extended and connected to forgiveness. Drink from it, for this is my blood in the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins, as opposed to just poured out for many. Matthew is often glossing and continuing themes that start in Mark. Mark leaves a lot implicit, and Matthew leaves a lot of things unsaid but implied. And Matthew goes ahead and says it, which is why Matthew's gospel is 28 chapters long and Mark's gospel is 16 chapters long. As they say on page 118, I think this is a really important part. The different versions of these stories indicate a degree of fluidity in how the Last Supper was remembered and celebrated. What they all have in common, however, is an emphasis on body and blood, bread and wine. Whatever connections Mark intended from the loaves and fishes meal to this bread and wine meal, there was nothing in that earlier meal that spoke of body and blood symbolism. What then is Mark adding here that was not present before. First, the point of Jesus' meals, from the loaves and fishes and to bread and wine, is to insist on shared meals as the mandate of divine justice in a world not our own. To go back to the point that Judy made.
Well, on page 119, he makes the point is neither suffering nor substitution, but participation with God through gift or meal.
Yeah, this continues that same point about atonement, that this is about participation with Jesus and not substitution, not a substitutionary sacrifice. Yeah, and that continues the same theological theme, which was one of the main ones that they made on was it Tuesday or Wednesday? I don't recall which day it was. They're all blending together now.
And aren't they calling this Passover story the second Passover? Didn't I read that someplace? And in a way, it also is preparing the disciples for the path, the way ahead, and sort of girding their loins for the difficult journey that is going to follow, just like the ancient Hebrews. And yeah.
Well, and remember, there's more than one Passover in John's Gospel.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Yeah, John's Gospel takes place over 3 years, and there aren't as many references to other years in the other ones, and so it seems as though Jesus' ministry is a year long in some of the synoptics and 3 years long in John. And so again, we're not going to find historicity, but we can find truth. And so it's important for that reason too. But I think part of the point they're making is that this is a new Passover in a sense, in Jesus, in the way that Jesus is taking this story and renewing it with, substituting the Roman Empire for the Egyptian Empire and Pharaoh. We read a lot about Jesus, as they also say on 119. It's difficult we wouldn't have the tradition that we have right now if it hadn't been for Jesus' violent death. His sacrifice of his body and blood wouldn't have had the same meaning if it had been if he hadn't been killed violently by the empire. And his willing acceptance of that fate, his nonviolent response in the face of that empire is, I think, an important part. It's what makes the meal make sense, because there was a sacrifice. He did make a sacrifice, to use our modern understanding of the word sacrifice, of one's life, as opposed to the substitutionary sacrifice that Christians are still leveled with in terms of our understanding. Yeah. Oh, I just got a text on my watch, and then it derailed my train of thought.
How dare they?
I know.
Today's world.
So yeah, I think they are revisiting the question of substitutionary atonement, and I'm grateful that they are, because I think I'm pretty strongly of the opinion that substitutionary atonement is kind of a lot of hogwash, and it's served as a way to make us feel bad about ourselves for a very long time, by which I mean for several millennia now. And I'm grateful for this reframing of Jesus' sacrifice in terms of a sacrifice in order to invite participation with, and not sacrifice for. Gethsemane, prayer, and arrest. This is a long section of 26 verses from Mark 14 to 26. Mark 14, 26 to 52. They go out to the Mount of Olives, which is like, if you've ever seen, that sort of classic picture of Jerusalem where you see the golden dome and you can see the temple platform, what remains of the temple platform, which now has Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and all those places on it. That's the Mount of Olives. That photo is taken from the Mount of Olives, which is really just like out the gate, down and up the hill. It's the next hill outside of that gate of Jerusalem. And so they're not, these are not long distances. This is the old city of Jerusalem is not gigantic. It's not a sprawling metropolis. They're not going super far. So they went to a place called Gethsemane again, which is just like right across. I mean, it's a 5-minute drive from the gates nowadays. You know what I mean? And he asks them to stay with him, and we see some more agitation, more real life in Jesus, I feel like, in Mark's gospel than we do in John. In John, John makes Jesus out to be, in the entire Passion narrative, makes John to be out to be kind of a very chilled out and above everything, accepting and sort of almost I don't want to say a caricature, but it's just like, I mean, he otherworldly in the whole thing. And I really admire that in Mark. As I'm reading it today, I'm seeing, or this week, I'm sort of seeing Jesus being much more human. In almost in the way that John's gospel is written. It's, and then Jesus said, well, couldn't you stay awake even just for a minute? Because he knew that was what was going to happen. And in Mark's gospel, you see the real urgency and the immediateness of his agitation and his anxiety, his fear going into this, which I just feel like doesn't come through in John in the same way. And I'm really, it's resonating with me as we travel through Holy Week at this point, this year, and perhaps because of how weird the rest of Holy Week is and how agitated I'm feeling at times just from not knowing, Yeah, so the Mount of Olives, Gethsemane, 100 yards or so outside the east wall of the city. So yeah, it's as they went on and said, this is not a long distance away. It's a football field away from the walls of the city. They're still very much within the shadow of the temple, when they're here doing this. Jesus tells the disciples they will all become deserters. Peter vows that he will not desert Jesus, and then he does. And then everybody flees. Which is, any particular.
It's hard to literally put your skin in the game.
We didn't have a sense of fear about our world right now. I don't think we'd be normal. There's people who have, there's degrees of fear. And I don't live with a sense of fear that I am knowing about right now. But yes, I do have some fear about craziness that's going on and where it's all going to lead. And I don't dwell on it. I have some fear about my family and their conditions. I try not to dwell on it because it doesn't do me any good. It's called worry in that case. But your fear, a fear of, I don't know what your fear is. Nobody knows what each other's fear is unless we name it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I interrupted somebody. Judy, maybe?
It's a reminder of how this really is a living word. And what I have found so interesting about Scripture is that it's so easy to see the relevancy in modern times. And it's to me reading this, it's almost like Jesus is sitting here with us saying, you know, try again to get this right, kind of thing. And you know, we live in a culture in which distribution is a real problem. And in my thinking, it's gotten worse since the 70s. That more and more wealth has been taken up by the rich, and it's like that the landowner not sharing with the laborers, you know, at all. There are landowners in times of serfdom that did a much better job of sharing with their laborers than others, and often they were the ones that prospered better. And when you think about it, our country prospered better when there was more wealth in the middle class. We really did function a lot better. One of the interesting things I've read is about the Bill Gates Foundation, and something which I was unaware was that a fair number of his contributions from the foundation are going to private businesses for good causes, to develop vaccines, to do so things. But he also has a financial interest in them. And so in this particular article, the question was raised about these wonderful foundations contributing to avoid taxes and any control by anyone other than themselves into the private businesses. So I'm going, okay, so this idea of the conspiracy now, or the collaborators now, are business and government collaborating, and what do we do about it? I mean, in order to really understand this article, I'm gonna have to reread it, which I haven't done. And the reason I'm quiet, because I did not manage to finish this today. I had a phone call from a college friend, and we hadn't talked for a long time.
That's important.
Yeah.
Well, in some ways, there aren't any actual landlords with any ties to the land anymore. There are corporations that have no idea what's going on.
They just know how much money they're bringing in and that they want to have more.
Yes, exactly.
It's all about money. Follow the money. Didn't we say that a long time ago?
Here, we've got a great view of your ceiling.
I know. This instrument, I have to hold it like that in order to, so I'm sort of like, okay, I'm a prisoner in my own house.
Okay, sorry, I was just saying.
Yeah, I know. It's it gets tiring holding it in that position. Can't figure out how to make it do anything else. Sorry about that. I'm so
Agree. Go ahead. I was going to agree with Kathleen. I think very clearly there's a wider separation from the rich and the poor today. And as we've gone onward, even in my not so long life, it's amazingly there's more division. And yet it's good to reflect that that's the way it pretty much has always been to a certain extent. And it's just not getting any better in spite of what Christ has told us to do in terms of, working against the injustices, but it still gets worse and worse.
Yes.
And this book points that out pretty well, that, that's Christ was all about, coming into the world in which he lived. But now it's even worse. It's kind of depressing. But we just have to do what we can do individually.
And corporately.
I'm thankful about the fact that I can crawl into my own bed every night. And it keeps reminding me that, and bothers me, but I can't do anything about it. I agree with you, Jim. It is pressing in that sense. What I can give more of my wealth, what wealth I have. I can give more of myself, but I can't do that right now. So it's a conundrum.
Yes, it is. One thing that I thought that occurred to me is we in order to balance out the power of big corporations, you need big government, but under the firm control of the American people. And what's happening now is that more and more it's coming under minority control that are heavily influenced by corporate powers. If you look at the history of the Roberts Court, a goal of Supreme Court Justice Roberts was to give corporations more influence over the government of this country. And he's been very successful at doing that and how he's bent the Supreme Court. And right now we're seeing our government trying to limit voters' rights and voter input. So I think what we can do is to really stir up our communities to make sure that we look for good, strong candidates and vote and become locally active. Our states are doing better as far as helping the general public than our federal government is. But we need to try to reverse what's happened as far as our federal government, you know, particularly Citizens United, giving such great power to corporations. One law that I would probably like to see considered, and this is just off the wall, no unplanned consequences, whatnot, is that if you have a foundation making charitable contributions, they can only be made to nonprofits. They cannot be made to medical corporations. We need our universities much stronger. And our universities are being bled by some of these contributions going to private business rather than to our universities, where research can be done without just profit in mind, but
Yes,
with the greater good in mind.
but
Our universities are in deep, deep trouble because of not having resources that they need.
but the
Let's return to the text.
Okay,
Yes,
I'm sorry. Yes, let's.
please.
We've got
I mean, to Jesus was
11 minutes is the absolute most I have left to be with all of you, and though very very impassioned, it's a little astray of Maundy Thursday.
I agree.
I think on page 125, I did like this comparison between Mark and John's accounts of the arrest of Jesus.
I did too. Yeah.
You know, in Jesus's vulnerability in Mark's gospel as compared with as they sort of point out the almost otherworldliness of Jesus in John's gospel.
Mhm.
You know, in the second bullet, you know, in Mark, all the disciples flee; they're terrified. In John, Jesus calmly, you know, orders the soldiers who are arresting him to let these men go. You know, this was to fulfill the word that was spoken. I did not lose a single one of them whom you gave. You know, in Mark, Jesus throws himself on the ground. In John, when 600 imperial soldiers arrive to arrest him, Jesus asks them, "Whom are you looking for?"
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's I am he says, and they step back and fall to the ground. It's just a very different account of what was happening there. And you know, in part because the story from John is so familiar, because we tell it every year on Good Friday, and it forms the sort of it's the Empire Strikes Back of the trilogy of Holy Week, to use to torture a Star Wars metaphor.
Okay.
You know, it's just a very different account in Mark's gospel than it is in John's gospel. And the familiarity with John's gospel makes this one feel all the more fresh as I read it anyway.
Part of my problem is that my page numbers are different than yours.
Oh.
And so I'm going, okay, gotcha.
Sorry, I didn't realize that there was an edition that would have different pagination.
Well, it didn't seem to occur until today.
And I have the Kindle, so I have nothing in common with any.
Okay, no, yeah, I have a Nook, which might be the same as the Kindle. I don't know. But I'm going, what?
On my Kindle, it can show me, for many books, it can show me what the page number is on the regular edition. I don't know if that's the same for yours.
I don't see them.
You have to press on it, probably in a certain place it should show it.
So often. So then the interrogation and condemnation is the next.
So we're all right.
Is the next heading that we're at. Jesus is taken for trial. It is interesting that there are two trials that happen in Mark's gospel, and that, you know, in the first one they just can't seem to get it together to get the right testimony in order to get him, as it were. I also did think it was very interesting to hear them say that this was not necessarily the Sanhedrin of later times, but rather might be a privy council of the high priest, which makes sense to me, and also helps to dispel some of the anti-Semitism that's inherent in the text itself. Because if you think it's the whole Sanhedrin that's trying Jesus and handing him over to be crucified, it's a different thing than if it's the privy council of the high priest, who has a vested interest in seeing a particular outcome, and all of whom go along with it when they hear what they want to hear. It's also, this is where they say it's most likely that Mark didn't know what actually happened, because none of the followers of Jesus are accounted for having been in there with Jesus at the time, and Jesus didn't have any time to say, "Here's what happened, guys." So it is entirely possible it was put together through accounts of people who were there. I mean, remember, there were, when we hear about Joseph of Arimathea, he was a well-positioned person and who could have had access at other times, and Nicodemus, who is mentioned in other gospels as having been one of the ranking elders in the community also, and who was a secret follower of Jesus, may have also would have had knowledge of what happened, although they're not mentioned as specifically in Joseph of Arimathea is. Nicodemus isn't in Mark's gospel, and so who knows. I also thought that the difference between an extra legal procedure and a trial was useful. I mean, this isn't simply a matter of the laws of actual justice, the wheels of actual justice being turning against Jesus. This is some shenanigans that's happening, and it's important to remember that. And remember, the temple authorities did not represent the Jews. Rather than representing the Jewish people, they were, as local collaborators with imperial authority, the oppressors of the vast majority of the Jewish people. They did not represent the Jewish people any more than the collaborationist governments of Europe in World War II or during the time of the Soviet Union represented their people. And again, as we said a few days ago, the anti-Semitism that is pervasive in interpretations of the Passion narrative are not only unsupported but wicked, and it's important for us to remember these things as we continue to engage these texts, which I fear we're going to have to. I mean, I know that there are those who say that because there is inherent anti-Semitism in these texts that we should abandon them, but I don't know how to abandon it without abandoning our faith, and I don't know how to change it. I think it's more important that we address it head on and take it upon ourselves to understand the flawed nature of the text themselves, and then to also look for meaning which can come from them that isn't flawed and wicked. And I just think that's a better approach. Better to know and understand the the limitations of the text than to yeah, than to just abandon them altogether.
I think that, I mean, churches that I've attended have, for years, said, okay, wasn't, it wasn't the Jews that crucified Jesus. But this gives details as to how you can say that according to at least Mark in Scripture, because it becomes to be much more clarified that it was the hierarchy of Judaism. It was like our leadership going awry, or any leadership going awry, and yeah, there is a problem with power and how easily power corrupts. Part of the discussion with my friend this morning was I was a delegate to the 1984 Democratic National Convention and flew in without the delegation for personal reasons, and was at the airport. I was struggling to get from Oakland to San Francisco, and a passerby heard my concern and said, "Oh, well, I'm going to San Francisco. I'm with the San Francisco Chronicle. Are you a delegate?" And when I said yes, okay, I got a personal ride into San Francisco. I get, and all the time I was in San Francisco, I mean, I was just a delegate to a national convention, but you're made to feel so important, and it's nice. I mean, it's very easy to just go, okay. And so I can kind of see how, well, you're a religious leader. You're teaching all these good things. So, and I won't be able to do this if I don't have the support of the political structure. I can see how that could be rationalized quite easily, and it was. And how then they'll say, well, this is really for the good of all the people. I'm doing this, or they will be worse off. Didn't they say that? Really, if we don't do something about this Jesus guy, we're going to have the Roman legions in, and we're going to be destroyed. Or we're going to be destroyed by the crowd. I mean, yeah, I can see how. But I will not be part of that crowd shouting, "Crucify him."
RC?
Yes.
I was wondering about on page 132, Mark has Jesus use symbols and words from the book of Daniel.
Yes.
And does he do that to show that Jesus is the true Messiah?
Jesus is what?
The Messiah. That he's fulfilling these prophecies in Daniel.
I think it does have that effect.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like much of Mark, it's more implicit and not explicit.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have people saying, you have far fewer people saying he is the Son of God, and him saying, I am the Son of God, but don't tell anybody, which is something that happens a lot in other Gospels. I think it's he does intentionally use Son of Man, and that's where Daniel is where Son of Man comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this to be, I was actually just reviewing the scholars and editors of the Common English Bible, which have taken the same path that they are describing here in this book of referring to the Son of Man as the human one. And I mean, that's what they're talking about. They're discussing why that happens and acknowledging that the text does say Son of Man, but that it's also confusing because so much has been put on top of the phrase the name Son of Man. And so they're trying to detangle that by using the human one and make it a little bit clearer. But I think Mark is clearly referring to Jesus as the Son of Man, or the human one, and as a title, and that does elicit those comparisons in Daniel, to be sure. Well, I regret that on Maundy Thursday, I don't have more time to devote to our conversation. You know, I think the framing technique that we see in the Confession and Denial on page 134 and 135, you know, that Peter follows Jesus to the high priest's house. Jesus is interrogated and confesses his identity, and then Peter is interrogated and denies Jesus. It puts that point again is another example of how Mark is using the example of Jesus to how shall one say, to show how the dichotomy, to show the difference of the person who does it right and the person who does it wrong, and sets us up to see Peter in his failure to live as a good disciple, and in his failure to confess Jesus the way that Jesus makes his own confession. It's just another example of this framing technique that Mark uses, which is pretty exclusively Markan, and I just find it interesting. It's everywhere, and this is the first time that I've encountered it in such in so thorough an example. Thank you all for your time today. We'll see you tomorrow for Good Friday.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Archie.